So a while back we got a huge announcement that after over 5 years, Kingdom Hearts Union Cross will finally be shutting down service. It was announced a couple of weeks back that Union Cross will be ending this April for the Japanese servers and I believe in May for the servers in the West. And while it was an alright game as far as gameplay goes, I personally didn't play it that much. I played it a bit, but then I just realized I really couldn't get into its gameplay, which is really unfortunate because with Union Cross the gameplay might be a bit lackluster, but the story in itself is actually really good. So instead of playing the game, everything I know about Union Cross I know from cutscenes I watched either on KH Insider or Everglow's channel. But I gotta say, Kingdom Hearts Union Cross had one of the better stories in Kingdom Hearts franchise. Like, say what you want about the gameplay, but I think the story was definitely a solid one. Even though it technically has yet to be completed and this could all change with one update, I'd frankly put the story of Union Cross up there with the better stories in the series like Days or even Birth by Sleep. Even being formatted as a game where you have to wait for updates instead of experiencing it all at once, it's done a really good job of keeping me coming back with every major story update. And while, again, I really didn't care for the gameplay, honestly, part of me is a little sad to see it end. Because when it comes to the story of Union Cross, it's made me realize that I kinda like when Kingdom Hearts goes into darker territories, and of course we see this in Union Cross's story because it's essentially becoming a murder mystery. Because that shows me that Kingdom Hearts can really dive into darker territories and still make it work, which gives me a lot of hope for the future of the series and also a lot of thoughts on what could happen to the series going forward. But that's not what we're here to talk about today. No, today we're going to talk about how Union Cross could wrap up its story in the next month, because if it's going where I think it's going, Union Cross could have a very interesting conclusion. Also, this will contain heavy spoilers for Kingdom Hearts Union Cross, so if you haven't caught up, I suggest you put this video in your watch later playlist and come back to it when you're caught up. But that being said, let's get into it. So as of right now, Kingdom Hearts Union Cross is at a pretty crucial point in its story. The Dandelion leaders have finally found out who the true culprit is behind Strelitzia's death, and that is of course the entity known as Darkness. In the December update, we learned that what ended up happening is that Ventus wanted power, and Darkness essentially gave him the power to make that happen. And with Lauriam finally figuring out who killed his sister, he ended up lashing out and is now currently incapacitated. So in what's shaping up to be the final fight of the game, it looks like Brain, Ephemer, and Skuld are going to end up against Darkness in a 3-on-1 fight. But based on what we know now and what we know for the series, part of me thinks that this isn't a fight they can actually win. Or more accurately, this is a fight that they're not going to win. Because in Kingdom Hearts 3, we've seen Ephemer in the Keyblade Graveyard, and we know about Subject X, who we can safely assume is Skuld. But there hasn't been any mention of Brain specifically anywhere thus far in the series outside of Union Cross, which is of course where he was introduced. The only thing that we've seen that's really related to Brain is knowing that Ericus is related to him in some way, because Ericus is of course a blue blood, which means he's related to the Dandelions. And of course Brain's Keyblade has also been passed down to Ericus as well. So that to me means that the Union leaders could actually end up losing to Darkness and could end up being forced to retreat. When it comes to Brain specifically, I think he could end up losing to Darkness or even end up dying altogether. But with that could kind of shape the storyline of Brain essentially sacrificing himself for the other Union leaders to possibly buy time for them to escape. And honestly, I think the most likely scenario is the Union leaders that do escape end up making it into the Ark. And since we know the Ark does have the power to transcend worlds, I think what's going to end up happening is that Brain is going to face Darkness by himself and let the other Union leaders escape with the help of the Ark to another world line. Because remember, what's taking place right now isn't in the original world line. What we're seeing now is what happened after the Union leaders had already crossed world lines. So it's possible that Brain will let them go on ahead, maybe Ephemer and Skuld place Ventus and Lauriam inside the Ark, and they end up leaving and going back to the original world line to of course end up in the current timeline. And now I know what a lot of you are thinking at this point. Crossing through world lines would put them back into the original world line, but that wouldn't necessarily bring them into our current timeline. But there is one thing we've seen throughout the story that's been fairly consistent, and that's the concept of time moving differently depending on what realm you're in. We've seen this multiple times, like with characters like Aqua in the Realm of Darkness. The entirety of 0.2 begins at the end of Birth by Sleep and ends up in the end of Kingdom Hearts 1. And that whole game maybe took a couple of hours to finish, but that was around 10 years in the Realm of Light. And we see this come back in one of the recent Dark Road updates when Baldur said that time has the potential to move differently in different realms. So what could end up being the case is that when the Union leaders cross back into the original world line, they could end up not where they left off in the Age of Fairy Tales, but somewhere around the time of Birth by Sleep, possibly not knowing where they are and having lost some of their memories from the journey, since that does seem to be the MO of using the Ark. And should that be the case, that would explain a lot of things. It would explain how Lee and Isa came into contact with Subject X and how they began on their quest to save her, and it would also explain how Xehanort ended up meeting Ventus and ended up training him as his student before he met Terra and Aqua. But one thing that could very well happen, or I guess something that technically already has happened, has to do with Brain's battle with Darkness. Like I said earlier, Brain could end up sacrificing himself and could die fighting Darkness, but something that we've seen in Kingdom Hearts 3 Remind is that Darkness is already in the current timeline. When Sora was going through people's hearts in Remind, we know that he came into contact with Darkness. Whether it's the Darkness we know of in Union Cross or another one that we have yet to meet has yet to be seen. But what could happen is that Brain ends up losing to Darkness, and before the Union leaders can really escape to the original world line, Darkness could have hopped back inside Ventus and could be hiding inside of him this whole time. And if that ends up not being the case, I think since there are multiple Darknesses, it could be another Darkness that found its way inside of Ventus. Personally, I do think the one that's more likely is the Darkness we see in Union Cross is the one that ends up meeting Sora in Remind. Really, either one could technically be true, but I personally think that it's more likely that the Darkness from Union Cross could have went back to Ventus after defeating Brain, since the Darkness itself said that Ventus is the fated child written in the Book of Prophecies. I'll likely explore what Ventus being the fated child means in another video entirely, but I personally think that if Union Cross can stick the landing as far as its ending goes, it has the potential to be one of the stronger stories in the series. But honestly, this is all just kind of my take on where the series could go, but what do you guys think? Let me know down below in the comments. And if you want to see more JRPG content on things like Kingdom Hearts and Persona, why not help your boy out by hitting that subscribe button? We're currently coming up on 1,000 members of the community, and I'd love for you to be a part of my journey. But that's going to be all from me today, so this is Moose Wayne, signing off.